BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Okay, hello everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. Just a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we begin. The first is that over the weekend, I did an episode about the disappearance of Brandon Lawson. I shared an update about that true crime case. And I've also done several short episodes here on Black Box Online Radio that have been 1-minute book reviews. However, I have to be very honest with you guys. This show is mostly about long-form content. The episodes are mostly long-form, and I've been encouraged by some people to make YouTube shorts, but in all reality, that's just not me. So I would rather use that energy in a different way and release them as just the old Black Box Online Radio's 5-day lineup. And you guys know all about Zodiac Monday, of course, and Wednesdays have lately been devoted to Jack the Ripper. Friday is the Anything Goes segment, and on Tuesdays I used to do a show called True Crime Talk Radio, which will be coming back this week. And for the Thursday segment, that has almost always been a topic that has been voted upon by you guys, the listeners. So in the near future, I'm going to do a poll, maybe compose some choices, or if you just have an idea for a Thursday show, you can put your idea in the comments section down below. And as always, hit the like button and subscribe. Those are some great ways to help out this channel, and you can follow along with all of these true crime discussions, as well as any subject under the sun or in the darkness for the Anything Goes Friday segment. And you can also go over to BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88. There's a link to that in the description box, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. Now, before we say anything further about the heart and soul of today's episode, I wanted to share some photos with you guys that I saw on Instagram, and these are from a religious ceremony in Spain. You might already notice some similarities between these types of religious outfits, as well as with the Zodiac Killer's 1969 Lake Berryessa hood. On September 27th of 1969, the Zodiac Killer committed the Lake Berryessa stabbing, which led to the death of Cecilia Shepard, and Brian Hartnell was the surviving victim. The Zodiac wore a black hooded costume that had a dicky flap that went down over the chest area with the Zodiac symbol, the circle with the cross going through it. He carried a gun and a knife, and he stabbed the victims. He held them up at gunpoint, but he stabbed them, stabbing Brian Hartnell first and then stabbing Cecilia Shepard. And I was just on Instagram scrolling up and down, and I follow this one publication called El Faro, and they were sharing some photos of a religious ceremony in Spain, and of course, this instantly stood out to me. You might be noticing some major differences. The Zodiac famously wore a black costume, and this one is purple, but I noticed how the dicky flap went right down over the chest, and also this person is wearing it over atop normal clothing. So the challenge question that I would like to use to begin the episode is it possible that the Zodiac Killer took the Lake Berryessa hood from a religious ceremony, or it was from a religious ceremonial set of attire, a religious ceremonial piece of clothing? Because, to be honest, I don't think that the Zodiac Killer was going to religious ceremonies in Ceuta, Spain, like this one in the photos. I mean, but is it similar to something else that could have been used in a different religious ceremony? And in the nation of Spain, actually, there are quite a few similar costumes that are worn for religious ceremonies. I remember when I was watching the movie version of the Da Vinci Code with Tom Hanks, and he was doing a presentation, and he's talking about the hooded costumes of the monks in Spain, and they looked somewhat similar to the one in this photo here, except they were in white. So that's the challenge question. Did the Zodiac Killer take the Lake Berryessa hood from a religious ceremony? And in this episode, I'm going to be discussing two new Zodiac Killer suspects, which I've never shared before on the channel, or that I haven't truly looked into before myself. And I will also be discussing the Zodiac Killer's Scotch tape letter. That is something that you guys have requested a response to in the past, but I have to introduce the material in a particular way, so I would like to begin by discussing the suspect David Meyerhoffer. And I first heard about him maybe 3 years ago. I was listening to an episode of the Opperman Report, and to be honest, I don't even remember who the guest was, but I heard that name, that David Meyerhoffer was a Zodiac Killer suspect, and I tried to look into him after the show, but I guess I spelled his name wrong so badly that none of the search results came up. But I read about a lot of other true crime cases, and even some of the ones that I don't talk about here on Black Box Online Radio, and I saw that name, David Meyerhoffer, that he was a real serial killer in Montana, and I finally decided to look into him as a Zodiac Killer suspect. Now, to those of you who follow this show, you will know that I do not like most of the suspects out there in the Zodiac Killer mystery, and I absolutely do not like the alternative suspects in the case. But with David Meyerhoffer, at first, I thought, maybe, just maybe, there could be something to this story, and I'll share the evidence for and then share the evidence against, because, as I said at first, there is definitely counterbalance that we have to examine. The first is that David Meyerhoffer was a confessed serial killer. He admitted to 4 murders in Montana. He also was someone who was ex-military. He had military training in electronic communications, and it goes well beyond that. I mean, he had knowledge of electrical engineering. He had the ability to tamper with phone lines, as well as constructing devices. And you might be thinking, okay, he is an admitted serial killer in Montana. Well, what does that have to do with the state of California? The Zodiac Killer was operating in the Bay Area. And is this like the Donald Lee Booyock theory where, okay, he drove across state lines and he crossed 4 states and going 1,000 miles in a couple of days just to commit a murder and drive back? No. Because on October 1st of 1968, David Meyerhoffer was sent to California to go into boot camp with the Marine Corps, and the first Zodiac Killer crime took place on December 20th of 1968, just under 3 months after Meyerhoffer is in California. And then he goes on to be a serial killer later on in Montana, but after he commits the crimes, he makes taunting phone calls to actually the families of the victims, not to the police, or the police dispatchers, or writing letters to the media, but he makes taunting phone calls, and the Zodiac Killer also made taunting phone calls. So, as you see, all of this is somewhat similar, and to be honest with you guys, there's an episode of the FBI Files about David Meyerhoffer. They actually refer to him as David Masterson, as in like a pseudonym to give privacy to the family at the time that episode came out, and they were reading off the psychological profile of David Meyerhoffer, and I didn't know if they were talking about this Montana serial killer, or they were talking about the Zodiac. They're saying, okay, it's some guy who's ex-military, maybe on the younger side, and possible schizophrenic, as well as being antisocial and a loner, not bonding well with the opposite sex, and probably has very few friends. Well, I was like, are you talking about a Montana serial killer, or are you talking about the Zodiac? I think the majority of Zodiac Killer profiles, I repeat, the majority of them, have those exact same elements all put in place. Now, I said that there would be some counterbalance, but one point that is right in the middle is that David Meyerhoffer was born in 1949, which would mean that he would have been 20 years old at the time of the Zodiac Killer's crime spree in 1969. And part of me was just thinking that, okay, wait, not only is the suspect pool growing, but the possible connections to Zodiac killer crimes, like the unconfirmed Zodiac crime list, is growing, and the suspects are also getting younger, it seems. I mean, in 2021, we learned about the Zodiac killer suspect McDuff, who was 23 years old. Last year, I was talking about the Zodiac killer suspect Robert Fulvins, who would have been 22 years old, and then David Meyerhoffer is now 20 years old. The suspects are getting younger. And how would someone reconcile that with the Zodiac killer's physical descriptions? Brian Hartnell, the surviving victim at the Lake Berryessa stabbing, said that the Zodiac killer's voice that he heard, again, he's seeing the guy with a mask on, but he heard the voice. He estimated that being 20 to 30 years old, so that works. Mike Majot, the surviving victim from the Zodiac killer's Blue Rock Springs shooting on July 4th of 1969, estimated that the Zodiac was maybe around 25 years old, up late, mid-20s to early 30s. But then after the Stein murder, you have these descriptions of somebody who could be as old as 40 or in the early 40s. Now, I'm going to share a photo with you guys, and you've been watching it going by on the screen, when David Meyerhoffer was arrested in 1974 for the Montana killings, and he definitely looks a lot older than 24 or 25 at the age of this photo. Again, born in 1949, so he should have been around his 25th birthday. I think that he looks 10 years older than his actual age, so you got some guy who is young, but looks old. And, I mean, could that also be a factor? Now to get to the counterbalance, because this is some important stuff. David Meyerhoffer was a serial killer who primarily went after children. He's referred to as the Montana child killer, or also the Montana child murderer, and I was like, wow, that's not even a good serial killer nickname, but, I mean, these are all terrible people, but still, that's just not a good one. And he did murder one woman who was age 19, who was within the Zodiac killer's realm of Zodiac killer's victim profile. The Zodiac killer's victims were between the age of 16 and 29. Betty Lou Jensen was the youngest victim. She was 16 years old. Paul Stein was the oldest victim. He was 29 years old. And he murdered one 19-year-old woman. But David Meyerhoffer was a revenge killer. The woman that he murdered was someone whom he had gone on one date with, and she did not want to see him again, and he didn't like that, so he broke into her apartment and murdered her. He also shot a boy once because the boy's brother had been either rude to him or mean to him in some way, and he wanted to get revenge on the family by creating an image of terror. So he shot him from a distance, and then he broke into a tent once and stabbed a Boy Scout to death in the middle of the night because that Boy Scout troop had excluded him in the past, and he wanted, again, revenge. As you see, he is a revenge killer. But David Meyerhoffer's most famous crime was the murder of Susan Yeager, who was a young girl at the time, under the age of 10. I believe she was 7 years old, but don't quote me on that. And this is where he makes the taunting phone calls to the victim's family, particularly talking to Susan Yeager's mother, and that actually ultimately led to his capture because he was giving away incriminating statements that ultimately leaked his identity. That's the long and short of it. There are a few more things in there, and also she had the ability to listen to different voices and listen to suspects in a lineup, and she recognized his voice, and he was having larger conversations than the Zodiac killer did. In the final conversation, it was up to an hour long, I mean, or thereabouts. But also, there is not this three-way relationship among the killer, law enforcement, and the media, because that's what the Zodiac killer did. The Zodiac killer was writing letters and composing ciphers and making phone calls to police dispatchers, whereas the Montana child killer David Meyerhoffer is primarily just mocking a family member of one of the victims. And, okay, those are some things that are different. Here's one final difference. With the woman who was 19 years old whom he murdered, he also cut off some of her body parts and wrapped them in butcher's wrapping paper and kept them in the freezer, and he was a cannibalistic serial killer. That's another one. But the real points that I had to look at were his whereabouts for 1968 and 69, because we can talk about behavioral profiling all day long, psychological profiling all day long, but how long did he stay in California. And to do that, there actually was an article that was available on newspapers.com. I used my free trial of newspapers.com to get this because it was behind the paywall, and I would like to read it for you. A Pentagon spokesperson disclosed Friday the Marine Corps record of confessed quadruple killer David Meyerhoffer of Manhattan, Montana. Meyerhoffer hanged himself in the Gallatin County Jail early this month after confessing to the previously unsolved murders in the Bozeman area in 1967, 68, 73, and 74. A Pentagon spokesman told the Associated Press that Meyerhoffer entered the Marine Corps on October 1st of 1968 and was honorably discharged on August 26 of 1971. Meyerhoffer said his first killing was on March 19th of 1967, a gunshot slaying of Bernard Pullman, 13 years old. That was the brother of the person whom he wanted revenge on in Manhattan. He said that he shot Pullman as the youth was, just going to be turning the page here, a friend and the youth and the friend were playing on a bridge. He said that he was the man who stabbed Michael Rainey, a 12-year-old Boy Scout, on May 5th of 1968 at a state park near Three Forks. The Pentagon told the Associated Press in Washington, D.C. on Friday that Meyerhoffer entered the Marine Corps on October 1st of 1968 and was sent to boot camp at San Diego. The Pentagon record said Meyerhoffer attended a communications electronics school at San Diego, then was assigned to the headquarters squadron at Cherry Point, North Carolina. From Cherry Point, the spokesman said Meyerhoffer went to South Vietnam in the 5th Communications Battalion. He returned from Vietnam to Camp Pendleton, California, where he was discharged in 1971. The Pentagon said Meyerhoffer's records show that he received the National Defense Service Medal, the Vietnam Service Medal, and the Vietnam Campaign Medal. Earlier inquiries about the military history of the 25-year-old confessed killer had yielded a Pentagon response that Meyerhoffer had never been on the Marine Corps books, and the Pentagon spokesman said that inquiry yielded an incorrect response because he said the spelling of Meyerhoffer's name had been incorrectly conveyed to the St. Louis, Missouri Record Center. Even I misspelled his name in the past when I was trying to look things up. The last two crimes the 5'6" Meyerhoffer confessed to committing were the 1973 kidnap and slaying of Susan Yeager, age 7 years old, who was actually she was actually a resident of Michigan, it says that here, and she was on a camping trip with her family, and the February 9th, 1974 slaying of Sandra Smolligan, age 19, his neighbor in Manhattan. That was the woman that he had went on the date with and then broke into her apartment to murder her. Now, as you see, he confessed to these 4 crimes, and the murder of Susan Yeager, as described by the FBI Files program, in somewhat of a non-scholarly way, was committed because he was just mad about something. He just felt upset that night. He felt angry, so he went out and committed that crime. It doesn't appear that there was any direct revenge motive, and when I said it's not a scholarly answer, it's because I was watching the show The FBI Files again. They have an episode about him, and the actor that was playing David Meyerhoffer in the recreations said, I just felt mad that night, and he murdered Susan Yeager, who was 7 years old, and went on to make the taunting phone calls to her mother. But firstly, rest in peace to all of these victims. No matter what, they absolutely did not deserve to die in this way. But as you guys see, it appears that after he goes through boot camp in the Marine Corps, at some time in 1969, he is then stationed in North Carolina and then in South Vietnam. And if you get on his Wikipedia, it even says that he is relocating in 1969. The Zodiac killers' reign of terror primarily took place in 1969. July 4th, 1969, the Blue Rock Springs shooting, but that's not the big one. Not even the Lake Berryessa stabbing on September 27th of 1969. It's that he would have had to have been in the country for the October 11th murder of Paul Stein, and then the mailing of the letters. The letters go all the way up to December 20th of 1969, with the Belvin Belli letter, which contained a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt. And this is not proven. I was really looking for those exact dates, and it's not proven. But it appears that most likely he was out of the state or out of the country at some point during the Zodiac killer's period of activity, partnered with the fact that he was only 5 feet 6 inches tall. He might have the psychological profiling that seems to match up a little bit with someone like the Zodiac killer, But if he's not in the state, and if he is too short, the Zodiac Killer was described to have been 6 feet tall at Lake Berryessa. He went from about a 5 out of 10 in terms of a suspect rating to a 0.5 out of 10. But what do you think about David Meyerhoffer as a Zodiac Killer suspect? And another graphic that you've been looking at that's been going by on the screen is for the book The Shadow Man. That's one that's been written about his case. One more time, he's referred to as the Montana Child Killer or the Montana Child Murderer. Now, I said that I would talk about the Zodiac Killer's Scotch tape letter, and this is one that you guys have requested in the past over the years to hear more about. And the Scotch tape letter is one that comes in 1978, actually. It is an unconfirmed Zodiac Killer communication, but it is going to be the foundation of the next suspect that I'm going to be talking about in this episode. So I would like to pull up the text of the letter first, and then we will go through that together. And the text of this letter has been made available at zodiacciphers.com. And I would actually just like to read something from the article that was posted there called A Game of Chess because it has an introductory sentence. On July 19th of 1978, a typewritten letter from Los Angeles arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle stating, "I am the Zodiac, and I am in control of all things. I am going to tell you a secret. I like friction tape. I like to have it around in case I need to truss someone up in a hurry. I have my real name on a small metallic tape. You see, while you have it in your possession, I want you to think that it belongs to me, and you think that I may have left it accidentally. I am athletic. It could be swim fans or a piece of scuba gear, but maybe you play chess with me. I have several cheap sets in closets all over. I have my name on the bottom of the lid with the Scotch tape. My name is waiting for me all over California. Do you know me? I am the Zodiac. I am in control." And this is going to become the foundation of a theory that is organized by somebody named Sam Fisher about his suspect, Joseph Paul Franklin. Because even on Zodiac ciphers, it talks about how primary form of tape that would be Scotch tape found in a tin or a metallic can would be Scotch cellulose tape, seals instantly without water, and the only real English name, on the bottom would say St. Paul, Minnesota, meaning Paul. Is the Zodiac Killer making reference to Paul Stine, the final Zodiac victim, on October 11th of 1969? Or was he stating that Paul is his name? And as I said, there is a book out by Sam Fisher called Zodiac Killer Identity that talks about his Zodiac suspect, Joseph Paul Franklin. Now, Joseph Paul Franklin's was not his real name. His real name was actually Vaughn, and he ultimately changed it, and there are some reasons for that that I don't even want to get into, but this is a good day for the FBI files because there was also an episode about Joseph Paul Franklin on the FBI files, and if you ever do get to watch that, it's an older broadcast, and I think that the best episode they ever did was on the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, and I've talked about him in several other episodes here on BlackBoxOnlineRadio. I invite you to look through some of them. But Joseph Paul Franklin was also a serial killer, and he went on to become the racist killer. And again, I couldn't believe that. That's also a ridiculous serial killer nickname. And some of the pieces of evidence that are connecting him to the Zodiac mystery are heavily relevant to the Scotch tape letter. But first, may I say, I think that he has a scary resemblance to the Zodiac Killer's composite sketch, and I do mean that, a scary resemblance. It really appears that he is someone who has the cheekbones, the chin, the jawline, of course the hairline. You're probably looking at some of the photos with him, and he has the shorter hair because his head was shaved in prison. But some of the other points about this, I mean, I just have to get to the heart and soul of it. It heavily connects to the Scotch tape letter because there was a stamp that was used to mail the Scotch tape letter of an American eagle, and Joseph Paul Franklin had a tattoo of an American eagle on his forearm. It's actually on his left forearm, at least in the recreations. And the image that I'm going to be using is once again from the FBI files. It's from the TV show. It's a dramatization, not his real tattoo that you're seeing on the screen. The other tattoo he had on the opposite forearm was of the Grim Reaper. And a major point, though, is that he would have only been 18 years old at the time of the Zodiac crimes. Again, these suspects are getting younger. It's quite shocking. But there are some immediate challenges that we have to examine. Number one, he's called the racist killer. He targeted primarily African Americans. He used a sniper rifle. Okay, it was a 44 Ruger 44 rifle, and he's killing the victims from a distance, whereas the Zodiac killer mostly killed them but from point-blank settings. And he was a nationwide killer. I'll give him that. That's actually a point in favor of his guilt, that he was a nationwide killer, and they even said this on the FBI files, that they weren't completely used to traveling serial killers yet. But last week on the Anything Goes Friday segment, I was talking about Ted Bundy. He committed crimes all over America. That's why I titled the first episode that I ever did on Ted Bundy, Nationwide Homicide. And there are other examples, such as Tommy Linsells, who was known as the Coast to Coast Killer, or the Cross Country Killer. Again, I think that actually is a point in favor of Franklin's guilt. But the whole racially motivated thing, the Zodiac Killer targeted Caucasians. David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Brian Hartnell, Cecilia Shepard, Mike Mageau, and Darlene Ferrin, and Paul Stein. Now, the only thing that would have tied into somewhat of his race war agenda was the fact that Paul Stein was Jewish, but Joseph Paul Franklin was a firearms enthusiast, and the Zodiac used a different firearm in every single crime. Even though the firearm was not fired at the Lake Berryessa stabbing, it's most likely that there was a different firearm carried at that point. It was a .45 caliber firearm based on Brian Hartnell identifying certain firearms. That again would be a point in favor of his involvement. But one thing, though, that I'm not completely sold on is, on the FBI files, they said that they were able to catch Joseph Paul Franklin because he was going to these different places throughout the American West, again, being this traveling drifter and serial killer, and he had a very pronounced Kentucky accent. He had a southern accent, and the people who heard the Zodiac Killer speak said absolutely he did not have an accent, he just had an unusual speaking cadence. And I would like to go to an episode, not episode really, but a YouTube video that has been made available on the channel WCPO9. This is a news channel, and it's going to be a little bit difficult, but you can actually hear Joseph Paul Franklin's voice, and I didn't exactly hear a hard Kentucky accent, like a hard Southern accent. Instead, it seemed to me that he was almost speaking in the way they would describe the Zodiac Killer, like just an unusual speaking cadence, but you can see here.
When Hamilton County Assistant Prosecutor Melissa Powers took the stand, Joseph Paul Franklin began looking tense. Powers is the woman who got Franklin to admit on audio tape that he murdered Dante Evans Brown and Darrell Lane.
I did it. I just, the only thing I can say is I did do it.
And can you also tell me why you did it?
I was trying to get rid of all the ugly people in the world.
Okay.
And
Why did you
I
select?
consider the blacks the ugliest people of all.
The victim's family listened to the confession, hearing Franklin describe in a casual, even cold way how he shot the boys.
I just put the gun right on.
Well, I think that's enough of that. You can hear what his voice sounds like. We don't need to give his vitriol any more of a platform. But I was actually somewhat aware of Joseph Paul Franklin, although I didn't know it, because he is the person who was responsible for the attempted murder of Larry Flint from Hustler magazine, and that is a crime that he would go on to confess to later on. But ultimately, I have to look at this whole racist killer example as just a completely different type of victim profiling, and someone who wants to start a race war, yet he's going to practice on white kids in Vallejo, California. I don't think so. And after looking into David Meyerhoffer's case and just seeing how that crumbled very easily, I'm going to put it into the same category. But one more time, there is a booklet out called Zodiac Killer Identity, Joseph Paul Franklin, and it is available on Amazon.com, written by Sam Fisher. And if you ever do choose to purchase it, it is 30 pages long. As previously stated, it is a booklet, but I mean, gonna try and approach everything with an open mind. And right now, I would like to go to your comments that you guys left on the episode that I did for the Anything Goes Friday segment last week about Ted Bundy. And this was called Serial Killer Ted Bundy Psychological Profile, because I would like to do a comparison between the Zodiac Killer of the 1960s and Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is perhaps the most famous American serial killer, and immediately you can see the differences. The Zodiac Killer is someone who went after victims in secluded areas. There isn't an immediate sexual motivation, whereas Ted Bundy preyed on women, he used blunt force trauma. The Zodiac primarily killed by gun, one time killing by knife, but also Ted Bundy was somebody who did this for a very sexual reason. Ted Bundy was also very physical with the bodies of the victims, dismembering them, sometimes even having sex with them. The Zodiac Killer was mostly hands-off when it came to the victims' bodies, with the exception of moving Paul Stine in the taxi cab. So it goes to show you that, actually, I mean, this is a terrible way of putting it, but Ted Bundy is somewhat of a normal serial killer, just with a higher body count than most of them. But, I mean, I would like to get to some of your comments about Ted Bundy, and we'll do some comparisons. Great show, Ned. This is from a Z247 who says, Great show, Ned. I wanted to bring something to your attention. There is a behavioral panel on YouTube. They are a panel of 4 behavioral analysts with a lot of experience, and they watch interviews with people who may or may not be psychopaths and comment on it. I just watched one about Ted Bundy. It is the most interesting channel I found in a long time. Also, I watched a movie called The Dead Girl, and it goes through a lot of things you discussed on this show today. Well, I would love to watch that movie, The Dead Girl, and I'm going to be adding that to my list soon. As far as the behavior of the Zodiac Killer, almost certainly the Zodiac was a psychopath or a sociopath. Almost certainly Ted Bundy was a psychopath or a sociopath, although in my episode I did read off some comments from the psychologist Al Carlisle, who said that it wasn't completely certain that Ted Bundy was a clinical sociopath, but some of the evidence for both of them, the Zodiac Killer and Ted Bundy, being psychopaths or sociopaths, relates to how they treated the victims. They just treated their bodies as lifeless objects. They showed absolutely no regard for their humanity. So I would say that both the Zodiac and Ted Bundy were definitely sociopaths. Maybe one of them was a born psychopath, meaning that they were at the level of just dealing with neurotransmitter issues from birth. Next comment comes to us from Jared Wignall, who says, Ted Bundy is one of the most evil people who ever lived, a truly twisted individual who is truly abhorrent, yet he's incredibly fascinating to look into. Thank you for talking about Ted Bundy. Have a good day and a great weekend. Take care. Thank you to you too, Jared, as well, because, I mean, Jared did have a point about how Ted Bundy is one serial killer that we talk about very frequently, but I have found in the Zodiac Killer discussions, his name comes up in the comment section a lot here on Black Box Online Radio. However, it's almost always an afternote, or there's just one sentence summarizing the entire story and the entire case into a single point about Ted Bundy, and, I mean, I think that just this, I have to reiterate this again, this is the type of behavior that we will see more frequently with serial killers, sexually motivated, killing women because of some type of overpowering desire to be a sexual deviant. And right now, I would like to get to your shoutouts from BuyMeACoffee.com. One more time, anybody who makes a donation via BuyMeACoffee.com will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And the first one comes to us from Batman. Batman bought you a coffee. I never get tired of saying that. And it says, in memory of my father, William Alfred Higgins, Bill, who went missing in 1969 and whose whereabouts are still unknown almost 55 years later. And yes, Bruce Wayne, indeed. Thank you for the coffee. And Bruce and I have talked about his father's disappearance here on this channel. I have a standalone episode about the disappearance of William Higgins from 1969, and there is also some coverage on this in an episode called Zodiac Killer, the voice print article, and the second half of that episode was devoted to the disappearance of William Higgins. I invite you guys to check those out if you're curious about voice prints and forensics, as well as the standalone episode on William Higgins to anybody who likes unsolved mysteries. Maybe you'll get some ideas and connect the dots. And the disappearance of William Higgins also showed up in the news last year. There was actually even a development in that, so always going to be paying attention to the stories that have been covered here on Black Box Online Radio. But what I think is something else that I would like to share with you is that voice prints were essential in the capture of David Meyerhoffer, the Montana child killer. And that was one thing that they were able to do because they were able to, just analyze his voice in a particular way. Technology was growing. But the interesting thing about the Meyerhoffer case that maybe I didn't say very clearly was it was the first time that behavioral profiling and psychological profiling were the primary pieces of evidence against a suspect, and that's why they had to do certain setups to try and get him to reveal information, not only with interviews and interrogations, but also by going through the phone calls that he made, the taunting phone calls to the mother of Susan Yeager and say certain things that only David Meyerhoffer should have known. Therefore, they were able to find that, yes, indeed, this person was the killer. But behavioral and psychological profiling were the primary pieces of evidence, and that's one of the subtitles of the book, The Shadow Man, The Birth of FBI Profiling. But thank you, Batman, for the coffee. And the next one comes to us from Drew, who sent this in to BuyMeACoffee.com, and it says that they were out of Fowler solution, so I hope you don't mind the coffee. I don't mind at all, Drew, and thank you so much for your regular support. And the next one comes to us from Floyd Black 53, who says that what a fab way to start the week, meeting in Ned's den for Zodiac discussion. Thank you. And yes, you guys really have been sending in an enormous amount of comments to BuyMeACoffee.com. And as you see from this episode, sometimes your comments will be worked into future episodes of Black Box Online Radio. You can also make requests by going over to BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. That email address is posted in the description box down below. And in this episode, I talked about 2 Zodiac killer suspects whom I had not discussed in the past, and maybe there will be some new ones that are going to come up, but to be very honest with you guys, I'm thinking that David Meyerhoffer and Joseph Paul Franklin are going way at the bottom of the barrel. And, there are just so many points of evidence, but then the counterpoints, the counter-arguments against them having any involvement in the Zodiac Killer mystery are just somewhat overwhelming. But to talk about some other things for the channel, there is now a playlist that has been assembled for the episodes about JonBenet Ramsey, and tomorrow for the True Crime Talk radio segment, I will be doing a final response, sort of tying everything up, putting everything all together, and I will also be discussing the book The Other Side of Suffering, which was written by JonBenet Ramsey's father, John Ramsey. For a while, that was a deep dive podcast segment that I was doing on the weekends, but mostly the schedule will be going through the weekdays, and I will be, as I said, talking about the True Crime Talk radio segment on Tuesdays. For the Thursday show in the past, I did an episode, like a regular set of episodes about the disappearance of Donna Lass in 2021, and that one actually went on for several months, and I couldn't believe all the things that were just easily available online, as well as the misconceptions that were available, and having to go through all these different types of articles and actually trying to find completely solid and consistent narrative just to the actions of Donna Lass prior to her disappearance. And some of the Zodiac-related content that I would be debating about doing for a Thursday segment would be, of course, the murder of Sherry Jo Bates from 1966, perhaps the most famous unconfirmed Zodiac crime, the Domingos Edwards murders from 1963 as well. But one idea that I've been toying with for a while is to do a segment on the Zodiac Manson connection. And that is just a name. The Zodiac Manson Connection is, of course, a book by Howard Davis, and it wouldn't focus exactly on his book, which centers on, 2 specific points. Bruce Davis was the Zodiac killer, and also that Charles Manson was the mastermind behind the Zodiac killings. In Northern California, of course, Charles Manson was operating in Southern California, but it isn't so much Howard Davis's book that I would like to examine. It would be to read Bill Nelson's book, who's the author of the book Manson, which does tie into things about the Zodiac killer as well, and then just looking at different aspects of the Manson family, because there's so many books that are out there, and I was just watching the Stones Unturned podcast last week, which is hosted by Thomas Henry Horan, and some people were asking him what did they think about the book Reflection, which was written by the Manson girl Lynette, aka Squeaky, aka Red, and I would love to go through that book step by step and looking at all the different stories, and that's really getting out of the Zodiac territory, but if it's just a little bit Zodiac related and a little bit Manson related, and to do something like the Zodiac Manson Hour. And yes, as you guys know, I was a big follower of the Tate LaBianca radio program in the past, and I had always been curious just about that, about doing a weekly segment, like how would I do a weekly segment about the Manson family? But as many of you guys have pointed out in the comments section, the Tate LaBianca murders are mostly solved to about 95% of the public's satisfaction, that Tex Watson and some of the Manson girls were involved, and some people think that Charles Manson was the mastermind to a certain extent. He spent the rest of his life in prison for it anyway. So in terms of a type of unsolved mystery, that is not necessarily a lot to investigate, and it would be more just about going through the stories of the Manson victims, as I said, Squeaky, as well as Leslie Van Houten. Of course, they've been the subject of countless books, TV shows, and documentaries talking all about their involvement in the 1960s as well, and then that's almost getting into some territory like Motor Spirit and Jared Kobach, just an alternative history of the 1960s. And back in 2020, I was talking a lot about the stories from California, the Zodiac Killer, of course, and I did a lot about Charles Manson, and then I got into the Black Dahlia for a while, and I noticed that almost all of the things I was covering on the channel were concentrating in California. And believe it or not, I did have an idea of like a way to morph Black Box Online Radio into something called California After Dark, where I would just be talking about mysteries from California, even though I was in West Virginia at the time. Probably not the most practical choice geographically. I mean, if you lived in California, you could go out and visit the sites. But that is not really something I seriously thought about doing at the time. Maybe even 10 years from now, I can think about something like that. But there needs to be a regular segment for the Thursday show that is usually left up to the choice of the viewers. The second Thursday show that I did was the Versus series, which was looking at two different criminals and comparing and contrasting their behavior, because I found that to be so valuable as someone who just goes through true crime cases, especially the episode about the Unabomber and the Anthrax killer. I mean, those things are just so fascinating when you look at just human behavior and how it plays out. But I think that a more appropriate way of doing the Versus series is to incorporate it here onto Zodiac Monday, because I talked about Ted Bundy and the Zodiac Killer in this episode, and I've compared the Zodiac Killer to a lot of other criminals, and as well as the killer of Sherry Joe Bates. I was doing one comparing the Bates Killer to the person who murdered Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. I'm tempted to say O.J. Simpson, but of course he was acquitted of the crimes. And that series, I think, was just a little bit too different for YouTube at the time, or maybe too different for my low-budget Black Box Online Radio presentations. And sometimes the episodes can be condensed a little bit into smaller ones that are just shared here in the Zodiac Monday thing. But that's the ultimate and final question. What is one thing that you would like to hear about for the Thursday show? As I said, the viewers normally choose the topic, and I mean, sometimes it's done on a poll. I'll present four options and you can vote, or there'll be other times when just someone has a really good idea for a show, and that will be the winning comment. So please put your ideas in the comments section down below, and anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box, and there is always BlackBoxNet88 over on Instagram, and I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Goodbye.